Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So I've talked many times in the past about 19th century warfare, which is my a particular love of mine, particularly colonial era warfare. Just want to throw in there, don't think that I've got any kind of like fantasy great ideas about colonialism. It was pretty awful, but nevertheless, for someone who's interested in military history, a very interesting period to study. And something that I've mentioned is, why were hand weapons, swords and bayonets and lances, why were they still really important? Particularly in the mid-19th century and even in the late 19th century to an extent. And in fact they did enjoy another heyday again in a little bit of a heyday in the First World War in trench warfare. But why, particularly in the mid-19th century, were hand weapons still so important? And it's a very pivotal time in the development of firearms. Now, in terms of officers, British officers, which is the accounts of which what I mostly read and study, because obviously I study British military swordsmanship of the mid-19th century, and that mostly or very largely relates to officers a lot of the time. Sometimes obviously cavalry troopers as well, but mostly I'm looking at fighting on foot, so the people who are carrying swords on foot usually are officers. And the other thing that they often carried were pistols. But as I've mentioned in previous videos, in the mid-19th century a lot of British officers didn't have pistols for one reason and another, and even those that did have pistols, lots of them had things like this. This is actually a French officer's pistol, a rather lovely piece in fantastic condition with a Damascus barrel and a walnut stock in perfect working order, and a lot of them only had a single shot pistol. Now it doesn't take a genius to work out that if you're engaged in a melee of some kind, you're fighting in some village or in some field somewhere, and there's multiple opponents and you've only got one shot, you don't have time to stand there and take out your little ramrod and get your powder horn out and or even if you've got a pre-made paper cartridge and stand there reloading. Okay, if you're in a melee, you have one chance to shoot with that pistol, and then if you have another one, which very often these were carried in braces, in pairs, to pull out that one and shoot that one as well, probably drop it and pick it up, retrieve it afterwards, assuming you survive. So you might have one shot or two shots. Now, when multi-shot pistols came along, there were double-barreled version of those that came along. That's great, fantastic. That's twice as many shots. That's a massive boon. And it's like a double-barreled shotgun compared to a single-barreled shotgun. It's a huge advantage. But really, when multi-shot pistols came along, it was a major thing. It really changed things. And so one of the earliest types to come along was the so-called pepper pot or pepper box revolver, and an adaptation of that was this. I'll talk about this more in its own video later, but this is what's known as a transitional revolver. It's essentially a pepper pot with a barrel added on the end, and these were made by people who were already making, in the 1840s basically, 1840s and 1850s, people who were already making pepper pots. And once the Colt revolver came along, which really just changed the whole pistol scene, they quickly tried to catch up and compete with it by adding a barrel onto the front of essentially the parts they already knew how to make. And when revolvers came along, this was the first one to change things in Britain really, was the Colt 1851 Navy. Now these were bought in large numbers by the military, although I say large numbers in terms of a contract, but not large numbers in terms of they didn't like equip everyone with them or equip all officers with them. And in fact, if we look at the Crimean War, for example, in 1854 to 1856, we see that actually lots of officers frantically were trying to buy revolvers or pistols of any kind really, but particularly the new revolvers. They were trying to buy those so that they could be more effective essentially at the front lines during the Crimean War. And same thing in the Indian Mutiny. We see letters from the Indian Mutiny, which is in 1857, where officers are writing home going, for God's sake, send me out one of these new revolvers because I don't have one, and the other day I was attacked and I barely survived, and if I'd had a revolver then I would have stood a much better chance of survival than I did. So this Colt revolver, the 1851 Navy, was one of the first ones that really became relatively widely available to British officers. But certainly, even in the Indian Mutiny of 1857, which is 6 years after this pistol came out, many British officers still didn't have them by that point. They weren't as easy to get hold of in Europe as they were in America, even though Colt had started up making them in London at a London factory. And of course they were expensive, and being an officer at that time was an expensive business. You even had to pay for like your accommodation and your food and everything. So in actual fact, the idea that officers were well off, they often came from well off families, but they themselves often were quite impoverished and couldn't afford extravagances like pistols, so they had to rely on relatives to buy them as presents. So what's interesting is that one of the debates that came up during the Crimean War and the Indian Mutiny, so 1854 to 56, and then the Indian Mutiny 1857 to 58, so this period that spans the whole centre of the 1850s, was people trying to replace or get pistols and then replace their old single-shot pistols with multi-shot pistols. And then there was a debate that ensued between the Colt revolver, which was famous because of course Colt had really patented, in fact, and pioneered this mechanism, and the British competitor, the Adams revolver. Now I'm going to do a video specifically comparing the Adams with the Colt. This is a reproduction, incidentally, by Uberti. This is the Colt London Navy, so based on pistols from around the middle of the 1850s. And this is an actual original that was probably at the Siege of Lucknow during the Indian Mutiny. So these in design date to basically exactly the same, but this is a British design, this is an American design. Adams got around the Colt patent. I won't go into too much detail, but because I'll save that for the future video, but Adams got around the Colt patent by designing a different mechanism, essentially. The main advantage of the Adams was that it was double action. That is, that when you pull the trigger, it shoots. All you have to do is pull the trigger, and you can go bang, 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 bang. With the Colt, you have to cock the hammer before each shot. Right, now, whilst that was the main debate in the Crimean War and the Indian Mutiny and the other wars around that period, between the Colt and the Adams, and people frantically trying to buy either of them and get whatever they could, there were other types of revolver and other types of multi-shot pistol around. And I was reading an account which I thought I would read to you because I thought it's just quite a funny account and quite interesting. And it is from, and I highly recommend this book if you're interested in the period, Under Deadly Fire by Hugh Goff. And Hugh Goff was an officer he went through a few different regiments actually, but during the mutiny he was primarily serving under Hodson of Hodson's Horse, and he has a very nice style of writing. It's not a big book, it's fairly quick to read, and it's relatively modern in its way of saying things. But anyway, here's the account, and I think it's kind of interesting, and it illustrates some of the points that I talk about the problems of pistols at this period. So, with a detachment of my regiment, I'd come to a village known to have been actively hostile, and my orders were to burn it. Lovely, lovely bit of colonial policing there. I found the village apparently empty, and had sent parties to set the houses on fire, waiting myself outside, attended by one orderly. When suddenly a fakir, which means like a religious warrior essentially, or kind of priest, fanatic should we say, rushed out from a building and came straight at me. His naked body smeared with dust and ashes, and his long matted hair, he looked a veritable fiend armed with a lathie or iron-bound stick. He bounded at me with a yell of fury, taking me completely by surprise. I had barely time to take out my revolver, which, unfortunately, was only a toy weapon presented to me by a lady on my leaving Meerut. When he says toy weapon, he means of small calibre. And the only pistol I possessed. I promptly fired at him, hitting him full on his left breast, but the wretched little pop gun failed to do more than just stagger him, when he again made a bound forward, shouting, and this is my pronunciation is going to be bad here, Hambi Marega Saw, which means I can also strike now, pig. And I had just time to draw my sword and ward off a terrific blow, which almost broke down my guard, that means his parry, but which I returned with such effect that he turned back and fled back into the burning village, cursing me loudly as he went. I saw no more of him, and I presume he perished among his gods, without the satisfaction of having gained his passport to heaven through the sacrifice of an infidel. He was a gallant scoundrel, but I cannot say his language was that of a holy man, which according to his lights he aspired to be. the harmless result of my pistol shot, which, though hitting him directly over the heart, had but staggered him, warned me for the future not to trust in such a miniature weapon, and I took the earliest opportunity to provide myself with a good serviceable Colt's revolver. So there we go, we've got someone serving at the time, and you know, probably what he bought was a Colt Navy. It could have been a Colt Dragoon, which is a far bigger and heavier version, a larger caliber. It's 44 caliber, this is 36. We don't know, but anyway, he got a Colt revolver rather than an Adams revolver. I have other sources where they say I want an Adams rather than a Colt, so clearly different people had different preferences. I think one of its virtues of the Colt was it was famous and a very tough and reliable and trusted mechanism. So despite the fact that it was single action, so fairly slow to reload, relatively speaking, it was tough. And the 36 round, so if that was what he bought and that was considered larger than what he tried to shoot the fakir with, then presumably what he was trying to use was something more like this, like a 31 .31 caliber pistol, which really was designed for self-defense in urban situations, and there was a vibrant trade making these small caliber pistols. I find it very interesting, that source, because it tells us so many interesting things in such a short piece of text. But it does show that he was serving, you know, he was a frontline officer in India serving in Hodson's Horse, and he had no pistol apart from this pop gun that some woman in Meerut had given to him as a gift, presumably, or a good luck thing. And so, yeah, just interesting to show, and also it helps illustrate again why swords were still so important in mid-19th century combat, because of course not only did a lot of them not have pistols or not have good pistols, but pistols didn't always have the effect they were supposed to have. He only managed to get one shot off despite the fact it was a revolver. It didn't stop the man still attacked him. You can't parry with a pistol. So even if you've shot the person and they're gonna die soon, if they're attacking you with a lathi or a sword or anything else, you need to guard, you need to parry, and there he had a sword, luckily, to parry with. So there we go. I hope that's an interesting anecdote from history. Hugh Gough, amazing guy, him and his brother both awarded the Victoria Cross. They're worth reading up on. And thank you very much for watching. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.